So I'd like to officially welcome all of you to the Stockbridge Library's Distinguished Speaker Series. And tonight we have with us author and scholar Randall Kennedy. Randall Kennedy is here tonight to talk with us about his most recent book, Say It Loud, on race, law, history, and culture. And this is a collection of essays really that spans the history of our nation. And one of the things that the book opens with is Mr. Kennedy's discussion of being, in his earlier years, really an optimist about race relations in the United States, and how it's been hard to carry that into the present time. So I don't want to say too much about that. I'll let you speak for yourself, but it is really striking in this moment that it is indeed hard to be optimistic about race relations in our nation. And just a little bit about our speaker. Mr. Kennedy is the author of 6 previous books. He's the Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He's a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia, of the American Law Institute, and of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences. He is joining us from Dedham, Massachusetts this evening. Randall, thank you so very much for joining us this evening. I will turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for affording me this platform. And I look forward very much to hearing what you and your colleagues have to say about what I'm about to say. So I'm going to spend a few minutes describing some aspects of my book of essays, Say It Loud, and then I'll subside and take on questions, comments, and by all means objections. I would assume that in a setting like this, talking about the sorts of things that I talk about, I would think that there would likely be differences of opinion, and the floor will certainly be open to all of that. So this book is a compilation of essays, 29 essays, written over the past 25 years. Many of these essays were published in magazines previously, but I redid them all. I updated and recast. I corrected. In some of these essays, I found that apologies were needed. And when apologies were needed, or at least I thought apologies were needed, I apologized. But let me describe a couple of the essays that I think people have found most interesting, or that frankly have meant the most to me. And I'll start with the essay number 1, the first essay in the book, which is one of the longest. And I think that the theme of this essay is probably the most important single theme in the book. The name of the essay is called Shall We Overcome? Optimism and Pessimism in African American Racial Thought. And the basic idea of this essay is that in the voluminous commentary about race in America, I make the claim that this commentary can usefully be divided into two camps, the optimistic camp and the pessimistic camp. The pessimists, when the question is posed to the pessimists, shall we overcome? The answer is no, we shall not. And the optimists, on the other hand, say yes. There's been a terrible history of racism in America, but that can be overcome. So one of the things I do in the essay is to set forth a history of these two camps. Let me start off with the pessimistic camp, because the pessimistic camp, in many respects, is the more interesting. The essay mainly focuses on African American thinkers, but in the pessimistic camp in particular, white thinkers have been very important. So among the pessimists would be Alexis de Tocqueville. No one has been more pessimistic about the prospects of interracial harmony in the United States. No one has been more pessimistic than Alexis de Tocqueville. He has a chapter in Democracy in America called The Three Races of America. And the three races were whites, blacks, Native Americans. And it is totally bleak. With respect to Native Americans, he thought, well, there's going to be unceasing war, and the Native Americans are going to be exterminated. With respect to blacks, the view was he thought that slavery might be abolished eventually, but his belief was that even if slavery was abolished, racial hierarchy would continue. He basically took the position. He said, I'm from an aristocratic country. I know what aristocracy is all about. But he said in Europe, when aristocrats were overthrown, you couldn't tell who had been on top and who had been on the bottom. He said in the United States, we're always going to know. You're always going to know if you're confronting a person with discernible African ancestry, you are going to know that person's forebears were enslaved, and they're going to know it. And he believed that the confluence of slavery and difference in complexion, that poisons the well. So de Tocqueville, totally pessimistic. Thomas Jefferson, you read Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, his position, blacks are never going to forget that they were enslaved, and whites are never going to forget that. He was totally pessimistic. Abraham Lincoln, same. Abraham Lincoln, throughout his life, that's one of the reasons he was so interested in colonization, because he did not think that black people and white people could share the United States. And so he was always very interested in the possibility of black people going somewhere else. Now, what about the black folks in the pessimistic tradition? Well, black nationalists have been, many of them, have been pessimistic. So Marcus Garvey, the United States is a white man's country. No two ways about it. On that, his view was, the Ku Klux Klan is right. It's a white man's country. Who would be some of the other pessimists? Malcolm X, for much of his life, Malcolm X said, forget about the American dream. Me and other black people live in the American nightmare. Thoroughly pessimistic. Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam, thoroughly pessimistic. His belief was, best thing that black people could do would be to retreat and create their own communities and stay as far away from white people as possible. Who are some of the other pessimists? My colleague, Derek Bell, first black tenured professor at Harvard Law School, thoroughly pessimistic. He had a belief about the permanence of racism. And I will mention one other pessimist, very important to me, a man whom I absolutely revere, my father. My father, born in Louisiana, was thoroughly pessimistic. He was not simply, he wasn't that my father was just a non-patriot. My father was anti-patriotic. My father was thoroughly anti-patriotic. He thought that the United States of America had unforgivably betrayed black people, and that's the way he proceeded. And we talk politics all the time, and that view of things was a big part of my household. All right, I said there was an optimistic tradition. Yes, there is. In the 19th century, the great spokesperson for racial optimism would be the great Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, even before the abolition of slavery, Frederick Douglass was asked, do you foresee a time when people of different races will occupy the United States as neighbors and as equals? And even before the ratification of the 13th Amendment, even before the abolition of slavery, Frederick Douglass's response was, yes, I can foresee that time. In the 20th century, the great spokesperson of racial optimism was Martin Luther King Jr. Read, or listen to I Have a Dream, August 1963. Or even more striking, his last speech as a civil rights activist. Well, the last speech of his life, in hours before he was killed, where he speaks of going to the mountaintop, and he says, I might not get there with you, but I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land. Optimistic. Now, in the 21st century, the most consequential racial optimist would be Barack Obama, who's, yes, we can. Now, for much of my life, I have been an optimist. And indeed, for a long time, not only was I an optimist, but I was a rather confident optimist. Not only was I a rather confident optimist, but I chided the pessimists. I really did. I would get, I would write about this and I'd be rather indignant and really go after the pessimists. Well, in the past few years, let's say the last 5, I've changed. I'm still an optimist. I'm still in the optimistic camp, but I'm a chastened optimist. I am no longer so confident. I certainly I do not chide pessimists the way that I used to. And, the question of, shall we overcome? Like the question, shall we be able to keep a democracy going? Those two things are related and they are in question. So I'll just stop. I end the piece with saying, I'm chastened, and I'm sure that part of why I put myself in the optimistic camp at all. I'm sure that part of it has to do with the fact that I have three children in their 20s, and of course, I yearn for a better world for them, and I'm sure that that yearning, that longing, that hope is part of what pushes me even now towards the optimist camp. Um, Now, what are some of that's like I said, I'd say that's probably the most important essay in the book. What are some others? One of the pieces in the book that gave me a tremendous amount of pleasure to write was a essay number 20, Remembering Thurgood Marshall. I worked for Thurgood Marshall in the 1983-1984 Supreme Court term. Each of the associate justices can hire 4 law clerks. The Chief Justice, I think, gets 5, but the associate justices, they are entitled to 4. Some have fewer than 4. I think some might have 3. But Justice Marshall had 4. I was one of them that year. And that was one of the great privileges of my life. I mean, for a solid year, most work days, I got to talk one-on-one with Thurgood Marshall. I mean, there's a strong argument to be made that Thurgood Marshall is the greatest lawyer in the history of the United States of America. I'd certainly be willing to make that argument. I'd take that on any day of the week. Thurgood Marshall, and I mean, here was a man who, you think about it, here's this guy, born in Baltimore, Maryland, grows up under Jim Crow disabilities, wants to go to the university. He's from Baltimore. He would have liked to have gone to the University of Maryland Law School. He didn't apply to the University of Maryland Law School. He was dissuaded from applying because the University of Maryland Law School did not accept Black people. So he goes to the Howard University Law School, which turned out to be a stroke of good luck because the Howard University Law School, when he went, was headed up by Charles Hamilton Houston, extraordinary lawyer, great educator, and Houston was Thurgood Marshall's mentor. Thurgood Marshall goes to Howard Law School, distinguishes himself. He's #1 student in the class. Goes back to Baltimore. He does all sorts of law work, but he starts doing civil rights cases. His first civil rights case was one of the ones that he liked to talk about. His first civil rights case, first one that he handled by himself, was a case involving a Black guy who applied to the University of Maryland Law School. And Thurgood Marshall is his lawyer. And Marshall wins the case. The courts in Maryland say, listen, Maryland, the state does not have a law school for Black people. At that time, what Maryland would do is give Black people who wanted to go to law school a little bit of money and say, you go someplace out of state that you can find. And this court said that is not separate but equal. And so since you don't have a black law school available, you're going to have to make way. This black kid's going to have to go to the white law school. Marshall always viewed that as sweet revenge. He becomes the lawyer for the NAACP. And between the mid 1930s and 1960, Thurgood Marshall wins case after case after case that leads to the destruction of Jim Crow pigmentocracy. And he's a lawyer at every level. He's probably most well known as an appellate advocate before the Supreme Court of the United States, but he was an advocate in courts of appeals, federal, state. He was an advocate in trial courts. He represented all sorts of people. He represented people charged with rape. He represented people charged with murder. During World War II, there was a terrible race riot in Detroit. The NAACP sent him to Detroit to write a report on the race riot. He did. He wrote a report called "The Gestapo in Detroit," about basically a police riot in Detroit. He was doing some of everything and putting his life on the line. One of the episodes he liked to talk about was an episode after World War II in Columbia, Tennessee. There was a race riot, and there were some black veterans who defended themselves. These veterans were charged with various crimes. Thurgood Marshall goes to Columbia, Tennessee, and along with other lawyers represents these defendants and gets good results. Relatively good results. I mean, all white juries, and even before biased all white juries, they get relatively good results. The police get really angry. They after the trial, Thurgood Marshall and a number of other lawyers are leaving. They're headed back to Nashville, Tennessee. And outside of the city limits, the car that Thurgood Marshall is riding in is pulled over by the police. The police grab Thurgood Marshall and throw him into a police car, and they speed away. The lawyer who was driving the car in which Marshall was situated, wonderful attorney by the name of Z. Alexander Luby, follows the police. At one point, the police slow down, they stop, they tell Luby, get lost, stop following us. He refuses. He just continues to follow them. Marshall thinks that Z. Alexander Luby's persistence saved his life because, according to Marshall, what the police really wanted to do was to turn him over to the Ku Klux Klan, and they were going to kill him. But then the police sort of got cold feet when these lawyers in the car, kept following them. So the police pull a U-turn. They go back to Columbia, Tennessee, and they find a judge, and they say to this judge, "We've got this guy, Thurgood Marshall. We've arrested him. He was drunk." And the judge says to Thurgood Marshall, "Listen, we can sort this out very quickly because I've got a nose like a bloodhound. I can smell when somebody's been drinking. So blow into my face and we can just settle this right now." Marshall acts this out. Marshall says, he goes up to the judge and he just blows in his face. And the judge just is, impassive for a second, and then turns to the police and says to the police, release this man. He's not been drinking. Marshall goes with Z. Alexander Luby. They take off for Nashville, Tennessee. And Marshall says that when they got to Nashville, of course, they did get some drinks. But he laughed about this. But this is the sort of thing that was, this is the sort of danger that he courted. And again, for a solid year, I got to talk with him about what he had done, about all of the people he had met. He knew everybody. Justice Marshall. You ever meet Duke Ellington? Yep. You ever meet, Billie Holiday? Yep. What about, Paul Robeson? Yep. Harry Truman? Yep. Dwight Eisenhower? Yep. General MacArthur. What'd you think of General MacArthur? Oh, General MacArthur was really quite racist, but yeah, I met him in, spent a day with him in Japan. I mean, he knew everybody. And he had many, many adventures. He loved to talk. And it was just thrilling, really thrilling to work for him. And in this essay, I try to convey my deep respect for Thurgood Marshall, my deep fondness for Thurgood Marshall, my deep admiration for Thurgood Marshall. One last Thurgood Marshall story. One of the reasons why I was so delighted when he offered me a job with him for a year, I grew up hearing about Thurgood Marshall. My father saw Thurgood Marshall argue a case in 1948 in Columbia, South Carolina, Rice versus Elmore. This year, well, not this year, I guess it was the presidential election. Joe Biden occupies the White House, or at least it's arguably the case that Joe Biden occupies the White House because of his victory in the Democratic primary in South Carolina. And his victory was powered by Black voters. All right. Up until 1948, Black people could not participate at all in the Democratic primary in South Carolina. It was an all-white primary. And a man by the name of George Elmore, small businessman, he owned a grocery store, he drove a cab. George Elmore challenged the white primary. And Thurgood Marshall argued his case. My father knew George Elmore, went to watch the case. My dad didn't know about the legal, stuff that they were talking about. What my father always talked about was how the judges, everybody in the courtroom called Thurgood Marshall Mr. Marshall. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, what's the big deal about that? The big deal about that was that in 1948, Black men in the South were not referred to as Mr. anything. If you were a Black minister, you might be called Reverend so-and-so. If you were a Black physician, you might be called Dr. so-and-so. But putting those two things to the side, otherwise Black men were, the Jim Crow etiquette did not permit Black men to be known as Mr. Thurgood Marshall was Mr. Marshall, and it made a very big impression on my dad. On the penultimate day that I worked for Thurgood Marshall, my father came to the courthouse, Supreme Court, and met Thurgood Marshall and talked about what it meant for him to see Thurgood Marshall argue that case in 1948. So in any event, that essay was a particularly meaningful one for me. I'm going to mention one more essay, then I'm going to subside and, you know, take your questions. One essay that has not gotten much attention, and I'm really sorry it hasn't gotten much attention, essay 26, The Constitutional Roots of Birtherism. You know, one of the scandals of the past decade is the birtherism scandal. You know, the allegation that Barack Obama was not a legitimate president, because to be a legitimate president, one has to be native born, and there was the claim that, you know, he wasn't born in the United States. Of course, that was Donald Trump. That's one of the things that really made Donald Trump a front runner, because he, you know, birtherism, he really pushed that. Now, there are a lot of folks who attack Trump and attack the other so-called birthers because, you know, it's quite clear that Barack Obama was born in the United States, and it was just sheer demagoguery to continue to allege otherwise. But in this essay, what I say is, I think our criticism should go a lot deeper. I mean, after all, what is it that gave oxygen to birtherism at all? What gave oxygen to birtherism is a provision in the United States Constitution that says that the only people that says that makes a requirement, a criterion for eligibility to be president of the United States is to be native born. Well, you know, we love to, you know, pat ourselves on the back about our Constitution. We love to talk about how wonderful our Constitution is. But think about that. That is an invidious discrimination in the heart of the Constitution. There are millions of Americans born abroad who are citizens of the United States who are ineligible to be president of the United States. No matter what they do. No matter what they do. You can go to Arlington National Cemetery, and there are thousands of people buried in Arlington National Cemetery who gave their lives defending the United States of America, not eligible to be president of the United States. You could win the Medal of Honor, for goodness sakes. You could jump on a hand grenade. You could be willing to sacrifice yourself. Constitution of the United States says no. Now, it seems to me that's terrible and should be it should be removed. People have been, you know, I'm not alone in saying that. Other people have said that too, but there's a real, you know, people are just not interested, I take it, in that issue. But I push that issue in essay 26. Give me just 2 more minutes. What are essays that I think might be somewhat controversial? I'll just mention them very quickly. I have an essay 15, called "Should We Admire Nat Turner?" Now, Nat Turner was a enslaved rebel, the Nat Turner slave rebellion. Lots been written about it, movies about it and such. I asked the question, should we admire Nat Turner? And my answer is no, we should not. And I talk about how in the Nat Turner rebellion, I make the argument that the enslaved rebels were not careful enough in the way in which they pursued their rebellion. For instance, they killed infants and some other, very, young people. Question, is justifiable? I mean, I make the argument, no. But I would have thought that might have generated some interesting controversy, but at least as of yet, not so much. And I don't know. With that, I've been talking long enough. I'll subside. Questions, comments, objections?
I just want to encourage everyone to unmute their mic and just participate in the conversation. If you don't feel comfortable, certainly use the chat box. But I think our audience is of a size that we could all participate in the conversation.
Well, it sounds like you still have some residual optimism, even after the last 5 years, about race relations. So what gives you any grounds for optimism at this point?
Well, I guess two things. One, most immediately, I mean, as we speak, I feel tremendous trepidation. I think our democracy really is in peril. So, I mean, I'm nervous. But, as we speak, can we see manifestations of tremendous change in American life? Answer, yes. The Vice President of the United States is a Black woman. The head of the Department of Defense is a Black man. All over the United States, in all sorts of venues, in all sorts of domains, in all sorts of walks of life, you see Black people in positions of authority, in positions of influence. And, it seems to me that's a big change. I mean, I remember as a kid, I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. I remember as a kid, when a Black person would show up on television, I remember my mother would, holler out the back, out the Negro on TV, and we'd run in to, try to catch a glimpse. Well, I mean, that's in my lifetime. So, we're still seeing change, and I think positive change. In my view, one of my favorite texts about Black America is a wonderful history book written in 1947, John Hope Franklin, From Slavery to Freedom. I think that, do I believe that's the basic trajectory? Yeah, I still believe in that basic trajectory. So that's why I am where I am.
Does the rise of nationalism in the last 5 years, however, give you any pause?
Oh, yes. Oh, are you? I feel.
I state the obvious, just.
No, and frankly, it gives me more than pause. I never, I remember 10 years ago, I would have said that no politician with national ambitions would dare openly traffic in racial resentment and animus. Well, I was wrong. I mean, I obviously I was wrong, and that Donald Trump became president, and that Donald Trump almost was reelected. I mean, we dodged a bullet, but it was close, very close. 70 million votes. So, am I nervous? Am I on edge? Yeah, I definitely am.
With, you know, with,
I have, go ahead.
I'm
I have
sorry.
a question, which is that, are your children optimistic?
Yeah, that's interesting. Good. Yes, they are optimistic. My kids, they are optimistic, and their view about these matters is somewhat different than mine. Um, my children have lived lives of tremendous privilege. And one of the things that I've tried to stress in the past, I don't know, several years, I've tried to emphasize to them that, listen, the way you live, you're lucky, and you should know that. You've worked hard. That's good. I'm glad. I applaud. But you're also very lucky. And there are millions of people of all complexions in America who have not been so lucky. And, you cannot or should not take your good fortune for granted. And unfortunately, the circumstances under which many Americans live is going to generate the resentment and animus and, frankly, the stupidity that has been, so much in evidence. So yeah, my kids view things in a somewhat different way than me, and one of the things that I try to do in my writing and teaching and just talking is, acquaint them with aspects of American history, aspects of the American present that they should know about and that are, outside of the bubble of their good fortune.
If I may just ask a question about the current Supreme Court. Many of us, I have a feeling that many of us on this call are very concerned about the future of Roe. I personally think that this court will succeed in overturning in all but name Roe v. Wade. But I think there's something else that's almost even more pernicious, and that is that the court will whittle away voting rights protections, and that will have the effect of at least changing for generations to come what our elections look like.
Yeah.
Just wonder what your thoughts are on these issues.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of essays in my book about that involve the Supreme Court of the United States. Like I said, I work for Thurgood Marshall, and he's one of my heroes. But I have a very jaundiced view of the Supreme Court. the news reports tell us that we have a conservative Supreme Court. I would say, no, we don't have a conservative Supreme Court. We have a reactionary Supreme Court. And people who are friends of racial justice, people who are friends of the rights of women, people who are friends of organized labor, what do they do vis-a-vis the Supreme Court? They try to stay away from the Supreme Court. I mean, they don't want their cases to go to the Supreme Court. They play keep away because the Supreme Court is clearly unfriendly to those interests. And the Supreme Court is not going to save us. I mean, if, there were some people who at the last election applauded the Supreme Court and said, well, see, the courts held out, the courts did right, the courts, did not fall for Donald Trump's, ridiculous claims. Well, yeah, that was a couple of years ago. That was that election. Next time around, oh, I don't know. And I do not have faith at all in this Supreme Court. And one of the things that I do in my book is I try to communicate what I view as a realistic view of the Supreme Court. There's a huge amount of effort that is put into creating a sentimental view of the Supreme Court. And in journalism, one sees it. I mean, it's a journalistic convention to talk about the political branches and then the courts. There's the legislature and then there's the executive. Now they're political, but but over here and higher up are the courts. No, you've got, the federal government has 3 political branches. There's the executive branch, political. There's the legislative branch, political. And there's the judicial branch, political. They operate in somewhat different ways. They have different traditions. They have a different vocabulary. They do their business in somewhat different ways. But are they all political? My argument is, yeah, they're all thoroughly political. In the law school world, my world, I think it's ridiculous the way that the justices are talked about. You take a person like, let's say, Anthony Kennedy. Now, when Anthony Kennedy was a mere judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, he had ideas about the law, and he would go to a law school, and okay, judge, good lawyer, okay. But then he gets nominated for the Supreme Court by some president, and then he gets confirmed, and now he's on the Supreme Court. Now he goes to law schools, altogether different. Now he doesn't have thoughts. Oh, no. He has a jurisprudence, capital J. There's this genuflection. He is now a philosopher king, and people handle him completely differently. And frankly, there's this way of talking about these people as if there was something meritocratic, as if the Supreme Court was made up of the leading jurists in the United States. It's not. I think perfectly good lawyers, perfectly good lawyers. Anything more than that? No. Every now and again, you get a person on the Supreme Court who really is a outstanding jurist, but that's every now and again. And what I try to do is just try to show in a realistic fashion what the judges are about. Now, a couple of my essays go beyond that. I have an essay on Justice Clarence Thomas. I'll read you the title of it because the title will, I think, tell you what you need to know about the position I take with respect to Justice Thomas. It's called, it's essay number 10. Why Clarence Thomas ought to be ostracized. And I basically say, as far as I'm concerned, he ought to be ostracized. There were a number of conservatives who asked, why is it that Clarence Thomas was barely mentioned in the African American museum in Washington, D.C.? Why is it that he's mentioned there, but not much? Why is it in so many areas of Black American life, Clarence Thomas is really quite marginal? And I make the argument that, he's marginal and he should be kept on the margins and he should be cold-shouldered. Why? Because time after time after time, he has voted in ways that are clearly detrimental, not only to America, to American democracy in general, but to the fortunes of Black Americans in particular. The worst of it was in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. It was the Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court of the United States, 5-4, one vote made all the difference. Clarence Thomas voted with the majority to eviscerate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, that was terrible on its own, but we haven't heard the end of it. As you indicated, the Supreme Court has clearly not going. It's clearly taken a position that is unsympathetic to claims for voting rights. Well, that poses a danger to democracy in America. And frankly, of all of the justices, in my view, Clarence Thomas is the most reactionary. More so than the Chief Justice, more so than Alito, more so than Kavanaugh, more so than Gorsuch. Clarence Thomas is the right edge of the reactionary Supreme Court of the United States. And, I view him as a political figure who poses a danger to the best values in our republic And therefore, I think that this person who, wields considerable power ought to be ostracized. So that's a little bit of what I think about the Supreme Court of the United States.
Can I follow up on something you said about trying to teach your children about the history of the country, including history that is not necessarily taught to people of privilege?
Mhm.
So I've thought that understanding the true history of this country is perhaps a way forward on race relations, and it's caused me to take a lot of books out of the Stockbridge Library. But I'm wondering whether now I'm finding out that people think I'm probably engaging in critical race theory. So there's the backlash. Do you think that learning about this country's true history and its continuing impacts is a way forward on race relations?
I think it's essential. It's not enough, but it's absolutely essential. And again, if you ask me, why do I feel such trepidation? Think about it. There are 7 states that have passed laws that are trying to erase this idea, critical race theory and other, basic, sort of racial justice notions, trying to erase them from schools around the United States, erase them from libraries. This is dangerous. And by the way, you're speaking with a person, I've been critical of certain features of so-called critical race theory. By the way, when I see the term critical race theory now, I put it in quotation marks. I mean, the politicians who are attacking critical race theory, what they've done is basically they've created a boogeyman. They have concocted something that they call critical race theory. They've made it very unattractive. They've made it look stupid. They've made it look coercive. They call it critical race theory. And of course, they're weaponizing it and using it. Now, critical race theory, sort of real critical race theory, the critical race theory that was produced by, Derek Bell and Mari Matsuda and Charles Lawrence and Gary Peller and others. I think that there are good aspects of that critical race theory. The 2 really good things were the idea that racism is deeply entrenched in American life and pervasive in American life. And my attitude toward that is, and I don't call myself a critical race theorist at all. I've been, rather critical. But it seems to me that idea is perfectly sensible. Who can deny that racism has been thoroughly pervasive in American life? I don't care if we're talking about the most public aspects of American life, voting, office holding, jury service, or the most intimate spheres of American life, sex, marriage, adoption. Race is all over it. A second idea that I think is a good idea for the people who call themselves critical race theorists was the idea that the anti-discrimination norms that were established in the second Reconstruction, welcome, good, but not enough to get us to where we need to, go to be a thoroughly, decent, multiracial society. I think those ideas are good. Do I have criticisms of some of the critical race theorists? Yes, I have 2. One, I think that some of them go overboard when they make the claim that, nothing has changed, that, we're living in an era of neo-slavery. What are you talking about, neo-slavery? Like I said, Kamala Harris, neo-slavery? No. That's taking a useful idea and going over the cliff with it. The second thing I don't like about some of the critical race theory people is I don't think that they are attentive enough to freedom of expression. Some of them, we want to ban racist books, we want to ban racist films, we want to ban racist ideas. Be careful with that. It seems to me that freedom of expression, freedom of learning, freedom of reading, those freedoms, those habits, a lot of struggle was engaged in to create those habits, and we ought to hold on to them. So I'm critical of certain features of critical race, some of the things that some critical race theorists talk about. But I think that the attack on critical race theory is a very dangerous thing, very ominous, that it's part of the authoritarianism that's that's looming. So more, or are we done?
I think we're almost done. We're just about out of time, but Leslie, I think you had one last question.
How do you teach 70 million people what the history of this country has been? Because obviously they have no idea.
Well, it's very difficult. Very difficult. And what I think your question really underlines, is the importance of what we're doing right here. I mean, this is, I'm learning from you, you're learning from me, we're educating one another. It underlines the importance of the library. I'm serious. I mean, people of all ages, we don't know, who's who and what's what, but we know that there are libraries that have on their shelves these repositories of memory, repositories that help to educate. And it seems to me that, we're going to have to do everything in our power to reinforce and spur education. And, that's one of the reasons why the would-be authoritarians are so down on colleges and universities. That's why they're so resentful. That's why they sort of ridicule people who like to read and want to debate and are open to debate. They don't like that, and they don't like it for a reason. And so, I don't have a magic bullet, but one thing I do know is that we all need to redouble our efforts and support our libraries, support our schools, support all of the sort of networks that help to reinforce, help to nourish learning. Very central. Listen,
I have an anecdote that
go ahead.
I'd like to share with you, and I think Wendy will really like this. I have served on a committee that for years has been very much involved in providing public support for the Stockbridge Library.
Mhm.
And there was several years ago, there was some resistance to continuing to support the library at a certain level. And a man spoke up who I knew that had voted for Donald Trump and it remains to this day a believer in the big lie, but said in public that he had grown up in a rural area. His family had very little money, not enough to have books. And he went to the public library, and that's where he got his education, and he would support libraries for the rest of his life. So I tell this story because I think that we should not make the automatic assumption that people on the right, that everyone on the right is opposed to the support of public education and libraries. It was a very interesting, revealing comment for me, and we've managed to remain friendly enemies. That's all I can say.
I'll take that on board. I think that's a good anecdote, and so be it. I think, yeah. I think, you need to be careful about painting too broadly. So I think that's a nice corrective. I think that's a nice corrective story. Yeah. Listen, everybody, thank you very much for showing up and for listening to me. And I hope that everybody will have a nice holiday season and get through this tough winter.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank you.
your very interesting and thoughtful perspective. I think we all have learned a lot, and hopefully we'll talk quite a bit about your discussion with us this evening. And I really appreciate, on top of it all of your advocacy for libraries. It's very well received here.
Right. Be well, everyone.
Much. Good night.
Right.
Night night.